Okay, welcome back, folks. Today we'll be looking some more at this unit and religion, and the unit, of course, Unit 2 of the Classical Era. That's 500 to 500, so 500 BCE to 500 CE. This span of about 1,000 years here is this very intense and quite massive unit. There is a lot of ground to cover. And the chapter number 5 for Eurasian cultural traditions and religion is pretty intense. So let's look at this question. It's the big picture question number 4. So as you can see, I'm kind of covering the big picture questions and some of the margin review questions during this unit, so that we have a sense of like the broader strokes. Absolutely, you're going to need to do a good job with learning the details. But by looking at some of these questions that are broad, we can pull in different perspectives and hit more of the topics. And then I'll go into detail on some of these. But how would you define the appeal of the religious cultural traditions discussed in the chapter? So to what groups would they be attractive and why? Now this is a special concentration on this one, on Chinese cultural traditions, because those are sometimes a little bit more confusing. First, some religious and cultural traditions like legalism and Confucianism found widespread appeal among the elite because they're reinforcing the social structure that defined them as elites. And if you look at legalism, which is a very strict set of rules and laws, if you're enforcing those, you're keeping people in line. And does Confucianism, which it should be Confucianism, but I think the little symbol there of harmony at the top right corner might have covered up my A and my N, so sorry about that. It's not Confuciani. That's funny. But Confucianism is going to also be a very strong reinforcer of the idea that... We're done?
Yes.
All right, thank you. I can't concentrate very well today. But Confucianism is going to solidify this idea of worship or being a good follower to not only your family but to your government and your emperor. So the goal is to create a world without chaos or disorder. And if you know this chapter and you've looked at chapter 4 of or this unit in chapter 4, it's a chaotic world of lots of violence and lots of empire. So there are 5 relationships that Strayer mentions, but I really think of them as being 3 main ones. But there are 5 relationships. There's the sovereign ruler, the husband, parent, elder brother, and friend. And I have a greater than sign that's pointing then to the person who would be responsible for looking up to that person and following them in the Confucian way. So the subject is going to, the subject or the citizen in that respect is going to be a lesser role than the sovereign would. The wife lesser than the husband, the child than the parent, the younger brother to the elder, and the friend to a friend, which is something we don't always think of and consider. But this is a really, almost in a submissive way, you are kind of bowing down to those who you consider to be important. It's a way of life that is ethically and ritualistically structured. So in China, there are 3 teachings that kind of support these ideas. One being Confucian and one being Taoist and one being Buddhist. They support it in this way. You may think, well, Buddhism doesn't support this. Well, yeah, I get that. But your work day is where Confucian principles would come into handy the most. Whether it be taking the civil service exams, which is what these people are probably doing here at the bottom right-hand corner, about to be administered the civil service exams. These are exams that would give people a chance to work in the government, the empire of China, And they didn't just pick people based upon family or relationships or whatever. They picked them based upon merit. And they put quite a lot of emphasis on these exams. So that in itself gives you this conduit for funneling the best of the best into the government. It makes it easier to look up to them. And at work, it's a similar philosophy. You're not going to have somebody become the boss or leader of a company or business at this point who isn't going to be someone who's worth it and who is important enough to lead. So the Confucian principles, and many people in China just consider themselves to be Confucian, and it's sort of a philosophy on life. The Taoist way, as we've talked about some in class with the founder Laozi, who was kind of a lousy leader in some ways in this way. I'm not saying he was lousy, but he left and took a walk in the woods and like never came back. That's like his legacy that he leaves behind, this idea of Taoism. And Taoism is a way of like leaving Confucianism behind. And a good way of thinking about that is that's what people would do on the weekend. But you know, Confucianism is a philosophy that looks up to those around you in a submissive to master way. In a sense, you're the dominant people in your society who you're going to look up to. And Taoism is not like focused on work at all. It's about like enjoying nature and being one with your spirit and yourself. So there's not really a concrete way of understanding life and death, and that's where Buddhism comes into play. So some scholars look at the Chinese world and they say Confucius during the week, Taoist on the weekend, and Buddhist at death. And in a lot of ways that makes some sense. These are three religions or / cultural traditions that are accepted and adopted by most Chinese. Even today, there's a sense of these three types of philosophies and religions kind of woven into the fabric of society. And they look at these three ways as just living life or just being Chinese. The rituals are not to please the gods, but rather they're spent towards living life on earth in a better way, in a more meaningful way, and getting along with other people. And really, what Confucius' ideas were about was limiting the amount of chaos. You don't want chaos, or the Chinese word for that is danhua, I believe, if I remember that correctly. It's this philosophy of chaos is bad and we need to rid ourselves of that. This is a really great, it's not a video, but it's a recording of the interview by Stephen Prothero. He's the New York Times leading bestseller, a leading author on religious literacy. So, you know, I've broken down some of what he said and put it in here, but if you're really interested in more of it, take a second to check this out, because I think it would really help. And if we get a chance, we may listen to some of it in class. So there's Taoism, which is called the way or path. And the founder, and one way to remember would be to say he's a Laozi founder, left, he scribbled down some notes about the Taoist way, and then was lost in the woods and lost into nature forever. And not saying he was lousy or lousy in any way, but that's the idea, that he would just leave it all behind. But this has happened before, even with Buddhism. Siddhartha Gautama leaves his family and friends and his very comfortable life and goes on a search for something else. In Taoism, that search really isn't for something else as much as it's for just living and breathing and being one with the world around you, and not really worried about conformity, rules, learning, and really to stop learning and to stop this dehumanizing effect of Confucianism, which is to constantly be looking up to those around you and living in this way which is always putting you in its place. So how do you find the way or the path, the Tao? You would sit and do nothing. You'd like relax and meditate. You'd do bear strides and bird stretches the way nature would be. It sounds silly and strange, but if you've ever taken a walk in the woods, and we usually do that after a big Thanksgiving meal, it's kind of a family tradition. We'll go take a walk in the park in Kingwood North or East End Park. It's a really super nice park, and we'd walk around. And when you come home after that, if you've ever done that, you probably have this sense of relief or peacefulness that you're not, maybe you lost track or freed your mind of the things that you were being maybe worried about previously. There aren't any Taoist gods or immortals. This is similar to like the idea of Christian saints would be immortals. And there were also female forms similar to the Hinduism way. So, I'm sorry I said there aren't any. I meant that there are Taoist gods or immortals, but they are similar to Christian saints, and also female forms of those saints as well. So, John Green has a really good video that kind of wraps up the mandate of heaven idea, this idea of the cyclical nature of empire in China, and how, yes, Confucianism plays into that and helps to fuel it, but the founding idea that Confucius really focused on was the leaders should be just and righteous and do the right things for their people, and if they don't, well then they should be replaced with somebody who is. This idea of the civil service exam and putting the best people in charge and leading companies and businesses and families and in government. So 2,000 years of history is kind of crazy to sound and say, but this is one of the longest continuing civilizations on Earth. Let's take a look at a different slant here, this idea of other traditions like Buddhism and Christianity that appealed to the lower strata of society, because they offered universal salvation to all believers regardless of whether you're upper, middle, or lower class, and it offered it to anybody, even women. This is a key function here, very key and important function, because what you're looking at with this idea of being open to women or the poor, for example, is that anybody is eligible to become a Buddhist or a Christian. And that's one of the reasons why it has exploded in popularity, both of these religions. And that's an appeal. And that's where we're trying to get back to the question here. If you're going to define the appeal of this cultural tradition or religion called Buddhism or Christianity, it's because it's open to all. This video is very interesting. It goes into similarities between Jesus and the Buddha. And there are so many. And I have a little bit more in another video about it, but just in the similarities between Christianity and Buddhism. And we'll again revisit this down the road with Islam and compare all three in some ways. But you can see here, there's the Christ the Redeemer statue overlooking the city there, and then there's also the great Buddha statue that's below there. But this idea of Buddha rejected parts of Hinduism while retaining some of its elements, and Christ rejects parts of Judaism while retaining some of its elements. Same thing. Buddha spread politically by the Emperor Ashoka. Christ spread politically through the Emperor Constantine. Some branches of Buddhism evolved into a highly ceremonial religion. As we'll see, Theravada Buddhism turns into Mahayana Buddhism. Catholicism evolves into a highly ceremonial religion with monks who withdrew from secular life into a monastic way of life. In Buddhism, you lose yourself to gain nirvana and escape from suffering. And what Christ backed is this idea of losing self to gain Christ and to enter into heaven, where there would be no more suffering. So very similar in some respects, and there are differences as well, but I think you can hang your hat on some real serious. And what I want to focus on, we flip back to that, is these are all things that would appeal to people. It's appealing to belong to a religion that the members of your society also belong to, first of all, so that it spread so fast is important. Also, this idea of the spirit or soul attaining a higher level after one's death. This is very important to know, in other words, that your life was spent, well spent, and you were being in some ways rewarded for that. Traditions like Judaism appealed to all strata of one ethnic group because they defined a special relationship between that group and a powerful divine entity, a covenant with God. And this is kind of complicated for some who don't understand the religion as well. But one reason why Judaism isn't as widespread is this idea of a covenant with God and with the Jewish people being a group. It's not that you couldn't become Jewish, but it's not as open and as inviting as Buddhism or Christianity is. So is that an appeal? I would say it's not an appeal. It would be something that might turn people off to the religions because it's not as open to them. However, Christianity and later Islam are stemming from this religion. You see Abraham at the bottom right corner, or bottom left corner, with his son there. These are Abrahamic religions, Christianity and Islam, following Judaism. So, how would you define the appeal of religious and cultural traditions? You could also think of it this way. Each cultural and religious tradition explored in this chapter appealed to its adherents, those who were for it, because it brought guidance for living along with a meaningful and order-driven way of life, because this is a very complicated time period. Why do you think all of these other religions, cultural traditions, just kind of explode during this time period? It is because it was a period of explosion in a lot of senses, including explosions of war and death and some very terrible rulers. And this is, in some ways, very terrible rulers. Like we looked at the first emperor of China. He was great because he unifies China, but he does it with an iron hand. So this idea of these religions all appealing at the same time is a very interesting one, but it probably is because this was a difficult time to live. So Socrates, how do you think the lesson went? How do you think it went? Because Socrates never answered questions, he just asked questions. Oh great, here we go again. Zeus, give me strength. And I want to remind you that even though this cultural tradition of the Greeks, which you could say is a rational way of thinking, where you're looking at the world scientifically instead of looking at religiously, do not be convinced here to think that all of these Greek rational thinkers were unreligious and non-religious and secular. They certainly were not all that way. In fact, very few would be, because there wasn't even a word for religion in Greece. The word for being religious or spiritual was just being Greek. It was that woven into their society. So this gives you a chance to take a look at big picture question number 4. And I think the answer is going to vary for every single person, but there are some ways that you can say definitely the reason that this is an entire chapter in our textbook is that the religious and cultural traditions of this time period did appeal to large numbers of people, and it did so for a big reason. They needed it, okay, during a very difficult time of empire. Till next time, don't forget to be awesome.